Government business, order of the day number 1, Telecommunications Legislation Amendment, Access Regime and NBN Companies Bill 2015, resumption of debate on the second reading.
I call the member for Wakefield.
Well, thank you, Speaker, for this unexpected call on this bill. I don't know where the member for Patterson went, but anyway, I'm sure he's got important business in the House elsewhere. Look, fundamentally, what this bill points to is the government's failure to really provide a digital equality of opportunity. And we know that for so long during the Howard government, we often hear those opposite talking about the previous Rudd and Gillard governments, but they don't talk much about the Howard government. 11 years in power, 11 years in power, a critical time for telecommunications and internet infrastructure. And what was done? I think they had 8 plans over 11 years. 8 plans and no action. And we all know that in 2007, and I know the member for Kingston can remember campaigning in 2007 about the internet. The Liberal Party's failure on this policy was writ large. Absolutely. It was writ large and it was there for all to see. And we were just at the beginning of people's needs for high-speed internet. And that, as we know, has only grown over that time. So let's remember where we began before the National Broadband Network came to be, before this debate came to be. We had dealt with 11 years of inaction in a vital area of microeconomic reform and a vital area of the economy, the growing economy, the emerging economy. For all of the new Prime Ministers, the now Prime Ministers, talk about agility and innovation, his party shows none of that. None of that. And their history is appalling on this. And of course, so when we got to government, there was basically a sclerotic system based largely around Telstra in the main, but Telstra did not have the incentive to invest in high-speed internet in places like Craigmore or in Andrews Farm or anywhere else. What we had was a situation where, in actual fact, there were significant disincentives for them to invest and upgrade their facilities. And I can remember having a discussion with Telstra where they just basically told me that they weren't going to upgrade the exchange in Craigmore, this growing suburb, because there was no money in it for them. They'd put in all the infrastructure and pay for that, and then other carriers would monopolise their market. So we had significant disincentives during the Howard era for investment in internet infrastructure in the then sclerotic copper network. Now, when Labor came to government, we made a pretty bold, I think, and agile and a policy of innovation, and we said we were going to have fibre to the preference. I hear the member opposite cry out flexibility. Well, we said we're going to have fibre to the premise. Now, that took a lot of planning and that took a lot of action, and it took us putting in place the great fibre network, the backbone. And as the member for Kingston talks about, a significant bit of microeconomic reform, removing Telstra as you know, the arbiter of the copper network. Probably the most significant bit of microeconomic reform and forming the National Broadband Network. So Labor put in place all of the architecture that we now debate. But what we had was, as we know, what we had when those opposite came to power, and I hear my friend from Kooyong, the cult from Kooyong. We know about his leadership ambitions, and we know you might be the next Prime Minister, Josh. You might be the next Liberal Prime Minister. You know, hope springs eternal, Deputy Speaker. Hope springs eternal for the cult for Kooyong. We know great ambitions of the branch members and indeed his own expectations for himself. expectations. Well, I'm sure the member for Bradfield is possibly a candidate for high office in a government led by the colt from Kooyong. I'm sure he could be treasurer, and we could have a dynamic duo there down there at the table. Perhaps the future of the Liberal Party in the next term, because we know the current Prime Minister won't be leading them. That's for sure. In one form or another, after the events this week, we know that this government is hopelessly divided. And just to remind those opposite, 2 Prime Ministers, 2 Treasurers, 3 Defence Ministers, a revolving door in your National Security Cabinet, a revolving door. It's like a hurdy-gurdy, like a merry-go-round in that place. I mean, the poor old defence officials wouldn't know who they're talking about. How many ministers of communication have we had during that time? I don't know. We've got. Are you the Minister for Communication? I can't ever recall. He could easily be. He could easily be. I think he played some role in that. But I digress. Off the bill, off the record of telecommunications, because you sort of hear those opposite. They sort of buy into this stuff when they're hopelessly divided. Hopelessly divided. And if those in the gallery recall when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, when the member for Warringah was opposition leader, he basically gave the member for Wentworth a hospital hand pass. He gave him communications, and he sent him out there with the explicit thing, I think, to destroy the NBN. That was the mission statement. I mean, we have here a program of great national significance, as great as the Snowy Mountain Scheme. I mean, imagine if Menzies had done that to Chifley's legacy. Imagine if he had sent out a member of the executive to destroy the Snowy Mountain Scheme, to destroy the snow. I mean, where would the nation be today? Where would its electricity infrastructure be today if we had an opposition of such mindless destruction? But there he was, because in the mind's eye of the member for Warringah, he remembered all those days at Sydney University and the great rivalry that existed even then by these great men of great ambition. I say that facetiously for those listening. So he had in his mind's eye the future rivalry that would play out in a coalition government. And of course, what he wanted to do is fit him up with something that the Australian people would see to be not fitting the national interest, that is, to destroy the national broadband network. So we had people waiting 11 years under the Howard government for any action at all, 8 plans in 11 years. I mean, an extraordinary amount of talk and malarkey. You know, we had the 20-year anniversary and everybody was falling at John Howard's feet, and that happens to Prime Ministers. After about 20 years, people start to forget all the bad things, and they forget the inaction on broadband, which cost this nation dearly. So the member for Warringah sends the member for Wentworth out there with a hospital hand pass to destroy the NBN, and of course at great cost to the nation and at great cost to people in Gawler or Craigmore or anywhere else in my electorate, in the rural areas of my electorate, who desperately want broadband so that their kids can get educated, so that they can run small business, so that they can avail themselves of new technology, of streaming television, which sounds unimportant. But imagine if we had a government that set out to not have television. I mean, that's the equivalent these days, to not have the great communication devices, wireless. You know, it's like being against the telegraph or any other bit of progress. I mean, imagine if we had governments that did. Imagine if we had governments that were against radio and telegraph and television, against progress in all its forms, and sent ministers out there to destroy the networks that would. It's the networks. So, and we know. What did they do when they got to government? Well, of course, they appointed this Vertigan panel, which sounds well. It's qualified in Liberal Party terms. It's stacked full of people who don't like the NBN. Stacked full of people who are going to do the government's billing. So, and I've awoken from his boredom and slumber, the member for Bradfield. We don't actually often see much animation out of him, apart from question time and just then. You get him onto certain subjects and away he goes. Well, there's life. It's like awakening the mummy. Remember that movie, The Mummy? That's what the member for Bradfield is like. You talk about the NBN, it awakens the mummy. But look, these are the broad figures around the record of this great panel and this great minister, the now Prime Minister, a Prime Minister that will not last the test of time. I mean, you just saw this week. I mean, open warfare between two Prime Ministers in the party room. It's extraordinary. And over national security, over the Defence White Paper, and leaks and police inquiries. That is what we're seeing. And you can trace it all back to one event. Like I said, you can go as far back as Sydney University when these two great men, in inverted commas, were there. This great rivalry began. So the member for Warringah gives the member for Wentworth the hospital hand pass, and what did he come up with? Well, fibre to the node. Well, hooray. Well done. Takes us backwards. Said it would cost $29.5 billion, now up to $56 billion for copper. For copper. Remember that? Now, is the Copper Art stores still around? I couldn't remember. Remember Copper Art? They've gone out of business. Remember Copper Art, Deputy Speaker? I don't know if they might have been a South Australian retail store. Everything in there was made out of copper. Everything. Right. Well, they couldn't operate today because the government's the main buyer of copper, this old technology. And anybody who's walked down a suburban street in a new suburb and had even the most cursory look at a pit, you sort of see the little tent up and the Telstra guy be busily in there. Yeah. If you had even the most cursory look at the pit, it was like looking into, like a cave. Yeah. It reminds me of the Kapunda mines. And I know the member for Kingston has seen them full of water. Yep, she's not the only person who's seen them full of water. So this is the brave new technology that the member for Wentworth embarked upon. He said that the copper would arrive this year. Everybody would have copper or HFC this year.
Tick-tock.
That's now doubled to 2020. He said it would cost $600 a home. It's actually cost $1,600 a home. And anybody who'd taken the most cursory look at those pits or talked to a former Telstra linesman, who have all been sacked now, by the way, or one of those techs, there was great knowledge in those old Telstra linesmen. They had great knowledge of the pits, great knowledge of the technical things. All of that wasted as they were made redundant and pushed off to, sometimes pushed off to contractors, but often made redundant. He said it would cost $55 million to patch up the old copper network. Geez, there was a heroic assumption. It's only blown out by 1,000%. 1,000%, $640 million. And that is an understatement. Anybody who knows these pits, full of water, sometimes full of asbestos, very, very heroic assumption that would only cost $55 million. He said 2.61 million homes would be connected to pay TV cables by 2016. Alas, it's only 10,000. They said that it would bring in $2.5 billion in 2016, 2017, and that's only $1.1 billion. So it's a $1.4 billion hole in the NBN Co's revenue line. We hear nothing from the member for Bradfield about that. The mummy's returned to his esophagus in a little chamber, the chamber of horrors, in which he's in. He says it's not worth responding to. He says it's not worth responding to, and I hear the cult for Kooyong. He's busy. I mean, you can imagine the cult for Kooyong playing fantasy football, can't you, Deputy Speaker? You can imagine him. He's a Carlton. Are you Carlton man? And I know the Deputy Speaker is as well. We'll forgive. Obviously this madness is bipartisan. But 20 years into their 5-year redevelopment plan, sounds like the NBN. Maybe the Carlton Football Club and the NBN new management should get together and talk about progress. But we know that he's playing sort of a fantasy front bench. That's what you can imagine the cult for Kooyong up there late at night, scribbling down who he thinks, and maybe even imagining himself in a war cabinet. I hope I get a Guernsey, Deputy Speaker. This great man, the cult for Kooyong, perhaps his government, and this is just a suggestion, should spend less time sort of focused on themselves and their own sort of divisions, 2 prime ministers, 14 ministers, 3 defence ministers, how many communication ministers, this revolving door that's all around division, and beneath it all, just the ambition, and not ambition for the country or ambition for policy or ambition for progress, but just ambition for themselves and for the offices they hold. And what a distressing thing for the Australian public when they were promised adult government.
I thank the member for Wakefield. The minister? Oh, sorry. The member for Hunter. Sorry, the question is will be now a second time, and I call the member for Hunter.
I'm with a super sub, Mr Deputy Speaker, a new addition to the speaking list. Let's be clear what this bill is all about, Mr Deputy Speaker. This bill is ideologically driven, and it underscores the key philosophical differences between those who sit opposite and those of us on this side of the House. And while I'm a super sub on the debate, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do note that the member for Patterson is an omission from the Speaker's list. Where is the member for Patterson?
Missing.
Could it be that the member for Patterson has worked out that speaking on this bill in support of the government proposition might be a bad thing for him in his electorate, particularly his new electorate, where he now, of course, faces an uphill battle against a resurgent Labor Party in the region and on boundaries which gives Labor a notional advantage. It's not too late for the member for Patterson to come on down and participate in this debate and explain to his constituents, both present and potentially future, why it is that he's about to ensure that this place abolishes Labor's legislated commitment to universal national wholesale pricing. We often have debates in this place which have a particular impact on rural and regional Australia. And I'll concede that sometimes there are merits on both sides of those debates. You can argue philosophically, ideologically, or in public policy terms which is the better approach, which approach will best serve rural and regional Australia. But in this case, Mr Deputy Speaker, there could be no debate. There could be no debate. This bill undermines the capacity of people living in rural and regional Australia to access the NBN at the same price as those living in our capital cities. We want to ensure that whether you're living in Cessnock or Maitland or Burnie in Tasmania or Armidale in the electorate of the Deputy Prime Minister, that if you live in one of those rural areas, you will get NBN at the same price as your city counterparts. This is a basic philosophical question. Some on the other side will no doubt say that no, the cap is still there on wholesale price and there's still a cap, but you'll be able to work under the cap. And this is where we differ. They think it's okay to let the market completely rip and let the market determine what the price impacts will be on consumers. I say something quite different. I say I too believe in the market, but where there is clear market failure, government intervention is justified. And what is the market failure here? The market failure is distance and geography. And we want a country where those living in rural and regional Australia have the same opportunities as their city counterparts, for very many good reasons. But members of the government have to understand we don't want everyone living in our capital cities. We want to develop populations in rural and regional Australia. And to do that, you need to be able to provide services in rural and regional Australia. So there is a sound economic proposition here. Cross-subsidising delivery of services in rural and regional Australia is a good thing for all of Australia. And there could be no better example than this. The NBN can be a complex debate, I accept that, but people can grasp one thing very easily, and that is that it costs more to roll out a broadband service in the bush than it does in the capital cities, purely because of distance. But should people who live in rural and regional Australia be disadvantaged by that? Of course not. Of course not. They shouldn't be disadvantaged by geography, because if that's the approach we're going to take, if we're going to accept that as a basic proposition, we'll all be living in the capital cities, which of course is impossible. So this is good economic policy, it's good population policy, it's good building economic infrastructure policy. Now, those in the National Party who sit opposite like to often attempt at least to differentiate themselves from the Liberals, and I can understand that, Mr Deputy Speaker. But the fact is that time and time again they confirm for us in their actions, not so much their words in this place, but by their actions, that there is nothing between those who sit in this place under the Liberal banner and those who sit in this place under the banner of the Nationals. No. And there could be no better example than this, that their willingness to just roll over and accept this attack on universal wholesale pricing. And every resident in rural and regional Australia today should be making contact with their local member, if he or she is a Conservative, and asking them why they are doing this. Of course, they're already asking the even more important question in some senses: why is this government delivering a second-rate NBN service? Now, this is another simple policy proposition that I think people find it easy to grasp. I think they do understand the proposition that the now Prime Minister tried to put, and that is that it's cheaper to roll out the fibre just to the node and allow the service to be delivered by copper wire the extra distance to the premise. I think people understand that, and then it becomes a debate about whether the savings that might be involved there are worth it, given the inferior quality of the NBN service they will receive because they're going across that copper network for the last mile. The problem is, of course, that even those who would support the proposition that it's an overbuild, if you like, to go all the way to the premise, or the cost is to justify it, will be shocked, absolutely shocked to learn that it's costing some $600-odd million to repair the copper wires.
Oh, what a joke.
$600-odd million to repair the copper wires. I must admit, Mr Deputy Speaker, I wasn't aware of that figure until I was preparing for this contribution. I was astounded, and I'm sure all Australians will be astounded. Those with investment in copper might be pretty happy about it, but it is just incredible that a government which said it would cost $55 million, I'm told, to fix up the copper, is going to spend $640 million on a 19th century technology.
Ridiculous.
I just cannot believe anyone would be so stupid, to be frank. It is a stupid proposition. We're going to have a second-class service. Everyone knows, no one would argue, not even the Prime Minister would argue, that fibre to the premises is not better. Of course they wouldn't. Fibre to the premise is better.
That's right.
Having a bit of copper along the line, it's like a chain. It's only as strong as its weakest link. Having copper in the chain makes it an inferior service. That's just a scientific fact, a technical fact. What we're really only arguing is whether you spend the additional money to provide the first-class service. Well, let's be clear. Labor believes in a first-class service.
Yeah.
Labor believes that everyone in rural and regional Australia, everyone in Australia, should get a first-class service. And we certainly don't believe that spending $640 million to retain a second-class service is a good economic proposition.
That's right.
It clearly is not. So I issue some challenges to the member for Braddon, the member for Bass, the member for Eden-Monaro, the member for Page, and many, many others, the member for Hume, indeed the member for New England, none less than the Deputy Prime Minister. I often see Cabinet Ministers these days, Mr Deputy Speaker. You would have noted cabinet ministers coming in here and talking in second reading debates in areas outside their portfolio responsibilities. Not very conventional, but they're doing it on a regular basis. Well, there's nothing to stop the Deputy Prime Minister from coming in this place.
Absolutely.
I'll make sure I don't sit down for another 5 minutes. I'm sure he can sprint from his ministerial office to the chamber in plenty in that time, to come down here and to justify
That's right.
why they are launching or joining in the launch of this direct attack on rural and regional Australia, why they are supporting the proposition of spending $640 million to repair a 19th century technology as part of their alternative NBN proposition. They need to come in here and explain themselves. And I could be wrong, but I think there probably will be an in-detail stage of debate on this bill, so there are plenty of opportunities for them to come down and to explain themselves. Plenty of opportunity. Some of them are on the front bench now, but as I've said, that won't stop them from speaking. They have set the new precedent. They have set the new precedent, and they should be down here speaking on this bill. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, just some facts. The Prime Minister said his new proposal. Oh, here's the member for Patterson now. I welcome the member for Patterson, who I understand will now make a contribution to this debate. It's an interesting thing, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The member for Patterson's been crowing in his local media about the NBN rollouts in his local electorate. The fact is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, since his government took power, the rollout has been slower than it was under the former Labor government, and under his government the rollout has been inferior, because no doubt some of that $640 million the government is spending to repair copper is being spent in the electorate of Patterson. I hope the member for Patterson has done his research and he can tell the House how much of the $640 million on copper has been spent in the Patterson electorate. I suspect it's quite a bit, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'll tell you why. Because I've had residents in the members of Patterson's electorate call me and say, I now have Malcolm Turnbull's NBN, Malcolm Turnbull's version, and it's slower than ASDL2. The system, the service people are receiving in rural and regional Australia under Malcolm Turnbull's plan, the Prime Minister's plan, is slower than they were enjoying under ADSL. Now, I can see the Minister at the table frowning, and I understand why he's frowning, because he can't believe that. You would not believe that a government could spend some $60 billion on a project that delivers an inferior service to the one they already had under ADSL. It is unbelievable, Minister. I can understand you frowning. Now, the member for Patterson has joined us, and I look forward to his attempt, at least, to justify why he is joining with his government on this proposition and why he has been prepared to just roll over and accept this inferior NBN and this $640 million investment in copper. But I'm still waiting for the member for Gippsland to come down. I'm still waiting for the member for Riverina. They can all speak on this bill. The members for Page, Eden Monaro, Bass, Braddon, the list goes on. All those who purport to represent rural and regional Australia, all those who are Nats who purport to be different than the Liberals, to be different from the member for Patterson, but go missing in action when they are required to be in this House defending the people they purport to represent. But it doesn't stop on this issue. We've seen in recent days and recent months their unpreparedness in a whole range of issues to defend rural and regional Australia. Their infrastructure rollout is hopeless, going backwards on what the former Labor government was doing. They like to crow about the inland rail build. They're spending less money, Mr. Deputy Speaker, than was the former Labor government. The reality is there is only one party in this place that stands up for rural and regional Australia on a regular basis, and that's the Australian Labor Party. And the member for Patterson, the member for Braddon, all those Tasmanian lower house members, including the member for Bass, as I said, the members for Edmund, Owen, Page and others. I hope they've found the member for Page, because they couldn't find him in the building when we asked in Senate estimates for his report on cooperatives to be tabled. But they all need to be down here explaining why they're not defending their local residents. People living in rural and regional Australia deserve as good a service as their city cousins, and they should be in this place along with the member for Patterson. At least he's been prepared to front up. I'll give him credit for that, defending their local constituents.
I thank the member for Hunter. The question is the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Patterson.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I apologise to the House for not coming in earlier. I was dealing with a contamination issue in my electorate, required some urgent attention. I'll address that. Deputy Speaker, I speak today on the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment, the Access Regime and NBN Companies Bill of 2016. Deputy Speaker, what a fascinating speech from the member for Hunter. Absolutely fascinating. Because, Deputy Speaker, prior to this speech, it's only been a fleeting mention in this parliament across 4 speeches with no detail or substance by the member for Hunter, the man who purports to stand up for his electorate. I would also remind the House, Deputy Speaker, that the coalition government prior to the 2007 election were putting into plan a system called Opal, which would have provided high-speed broadband wireless across most of our nation at a cost of less than $1 billion. Well, one of the first things that the Labor government did, supported by the member for Hunter, is abolish that. And then they rolled out the NBN broadband, which was originally about a $5 billion program, and then just went up tenfold and more and delivered nothing. So the question that the member for Hunter should ask himself and actually explain to his constituents is indeed the member for Newcastle, and particularly through the actions of the former member for Newcastle, is given the NBN plan was their design, given they championed it so much, given they went to 2 elections pushing and promoting, what was the rollout in their electorate? What was the rollout in their electorate? Well, I've got to say to you, Deputy Speaker, virtually nothing. In fact, this is the opposition when in government who wanted to provide the satellite services and didn't even provide sufficient capacity for regional and rural Australians that we hear the member for Hunter standing up and wanting to represent so much, couldn't even put enough capacity on the satellite, and it took the coalition government's actions to put into place a second satellite to carry the load. Deputy Speaker, the other thing I'd remind the House about is how the former Labor government would approach the NBN rollout. And they put out all these glorious sheets about build commence and what would happen in each area, when the reality is it was only a bit of paper and there was no action. By contrast, Deputy Speaker, the coalition has implemented a policy and a plan that when build commence dates start, that is when they start. So if I can go through and highlight to some of the House some of the areas, and in particular in areas that are currently in the member for Hunter's seat and soon to come into the seat of Patterson, that the fixed line build commencement dates started in October 2015, affecting 7,180 households. The build commence dates have started in Aberglasslyn, Ashtonfield, Bulwarra Heights, East Maitland, Gilliston Heights, Horseshoe Bend, Largs Lawn, Louth Park, Maitland, Medford, Minderibba, Morpeth, Oakhampton, Pitnacree, Raworth, Rutherford, South Maitland, Tulare, Tanambit and Windella. Can I also say, Deputy Speaker, that in the second half of 2017 the commitment is to commence the rollout in Abermain, Cliftley, Heddon, Greta, Curry, Neath, Pelaw, Stanford, Meath and Weston. In Newcastle, Deputy Speaker, in the 4th quarter of 2016, the build commence will go through Beresfield, Chisholm, Hexham, Taro, Thornton, Woodbury, Fern Bay, Fullerton Cove, Kooragang and Stockton. And in my electorate, Mr Speaker, in the second half of 2017, the build will occur in Lemon Tree Passage, Malaboola, Madawi, Saltash and Tanooba Bay. In the third quarter of this year, it'll go through Ferradale, Heatherbrae, Raymond Terrace and Tomago. And of course, in December 2015, the build for fixed line has started in Anna Bay, Boat Harbour, Corlett, Fingal Bay, Fisherman's Bay, Nelson Bay, 1 Mile, Salamander Bay, Shoal Bay, Soldiers Point and Taylor's Beach. Of course, there have been massive rollouts of the fixed wireless system, and of course, in October 2015, areas such as Buchanan, Hexham, Lenigan, Raymond Terrace, Sawyers Gully and Talara have received that. And in the first quarter 2017, the build will occur for the fixed wireless in Anna Bay, Fullerton Cove and Saltash. Deputy Speaker, that is a definite plan. That is a definite plan. But I can remember being in this House in 2005-06, and I raised the issue of Thornton, which wasn't in my electorate, but across the road from my electorate, about how they were on pair-gain copper, and they could not get ADSL. And the then member for Newcastle, Sharon Grierson, campaigning in that election, said it's got to be fixed. It's an urgent priority. Well, guess what, Deputy Speaker? Through the inception of the NBN rollout plan, through 6 years of Labor government, nothing was done in Thornton. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So for the member for Hunter to come in here and complain about it not happening, I would ask him to be accountable for his plan, his 6 years of inactivity, his 6 years of failed representation of the people that he seeks to represent. But then again, Deputy Speaker, we know how he fails to represent people, because he's just taken the easy option. He lost half of his seat of Hunter into the seat of Patterson. But rather than standing up and having a fight in a marginal seat campaign, he wanted the safe option, a safe seat, and is being locked in by the executive of the Labor Party into the seat of Hunter. Deputy Speaker, he might make words on the floor of this parliament about his ability to stand up and fight, but when it comes to the street, let me tell you, he put on that yellow coat and run. He didn't want to take me on. He ran away. He's got no guts for a marginal seat fight. He just wanted that safe haven house that he's always been used to. Never had to fight a marginal seat campaign in his life. Never been committed to delivering anything for his constituents. So don't you come in here and lecture me, member for Hunter, because at the end of the day, you lack the intestinal fortitude, the backbone to stand up for your constituents and fight the fight. And on the NBN,
we'll get back to the bill. You've had a fair run. Stick to the bill, please.
Well, I would have thought you might have reminded the member for Hunter, Deputy Speaker, when he was making his comments, but be that as it be. I'm getting back to the NBN. There are a couple of key and critical issues have been reported to me into the NBN. And that's where people are coming to me and saying, well, I'm not getting the increased speed. Well, Deputy Speaker, a lot of the increased speed comes with cost to the individual. If people want higher bandwidth when they're on the NBN, then the plan that they must subscribe to will come at an increased cost. And one of the unfortunate things is that the Labor Party, when in government, led everyone to believe they'd have super high-speed broadband at no additional cost to them as the individual. And it comes down to the basic plan. Deputy Speaker, if you go onto the NBN network and you want to pay the same price for the same speed that you were getting under ADSL, then that's the speed that you will get off the NBN optical fibre. That's the speed that you will get. Now, Deputy Speaker, this government has rolled out the NBN across Australia, and we are on time and on plan to deliver it across the nation. Can I say to you, Deputy Speaker, this was a basket case that we inherited. Labor kept putting out proposals of what they would do and where it would roll out, and can I say to you, each time there was a plan, there were adjustments. We're not delivering. We're not going down that area. So, Deputy Speaker, what they were doing was playing with people. And I give you proof of this. You only need to look in our region in the Hunter at how little was done with the commencement under the Labor government. How little. Nothing. In fact, more has been done by private developers who have had to install the optical fibre in new developments than has been done by NBN when Labor were in government. More was done by private corporations installing optical fibre as a part of their development rollout, as required by legislation. So, Deputy Speaker, enough of the rhetoric from the member for Hunter, who on I think about 4 occasions prior to today had a fleeting mention of the NBN. So where was his stand-up within his own party to Senator Conroy and demanding that his area, that he claims he so valiantly represented and has now deserted, where was their NBN rollout? And the same could be said, as I say, for the former member for Newcastle, who used to carry on uphill down Dale about Thornton, but not one attempt to roll the NBN out through Thornton. I'm glad to see that it's now in the current plan, and I'm glad to see that the Turnbull government will deliver this NBN rollout as laid out. We're not giving false hopes. These are dates of build commencements, when the community will see the trenches and the excavators and the pipe layers in the streets delivering real and measurable. Deputy Speaker, in relation to the optical fibre, anything is better than the pair gain that the people in areas like Thornton suffer. And what we need to make sure is that they have access. Under the Labor Party, Deputy Speaker, they might have had their rolled gold system, but at the end of the day, at what expense? At what expense to the taxpayer? Remember, Deputy Speaker, and I ask people to go back, when the original NBN plan— God, you sound like a raving parrot. Have you ever thought about having any manners?
The member for Patterson will withdraw that remark.
Well, I would ask you to draw it to account, Deputy
Don't
Speaker.
reflect on
I
the
can't
chair.
even help
I've
myself
asked
think
you
when she's
to
carrying on
withdraw
like
that
that.
remark, or I'll sit you down. Your choice.
Deputy Speaker.
I've asked you to
the
withdraw that remark.
Which one? That she's
You know
parrot?
exactly what you said.
Well, I'll withdraw the fact she's a parrot. It's probably
Now, you
derogative
withdraw
to parrots.
unreservedly.
I'm not
You'll
fi-
withdraw unreservedly.
I'll withdraw unreservedly. Deputy Speaker, the reality is, yes, we need improved communication systems. The expectations of community and the availability of programs and software and viewing options are increasing. But it won't come about, as under the former Labor government, in just putting out bits of paper with what we think we're going to do. It'll actually come about with detailed plans, commitments to rollouts, and that's what the Coalition have done.
I thank the member for Patterson. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to deliver this summing up speech, and I thank all members for their contribution to this debate. The Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Access Regime and NBN Companies Bill 2015 sought to enhance the telecommunications access regime and NBN Co's line of business restrictions. The government has amended the bill to include only the measures that are accepted by Labor and the Greens, or to be precise, the government will shortly move amendments which will have the effect, if accepted, of amending the bill to include only the measures that are accepted by Labor and the Greens in the dissenting Senate Environment and Communications Legislation Committee report to ensure that uncontested measures proceed. There are now, or there will be, should those amendments be accepted, 4 measures remaining in the bill, which will take effect should the bill be passed in that form. First, changes to the Telecommunications Act and the Competition and Consumer Act to clarify the regulation of facilities access. Secondly, changes to the standard access obligations, which will ensure that a service provider who controls or owns in-building cabling must provide access to that cabling as part of providing access to a declared service. This removes scope for restricting access to competitors and ensures end users can get faster access to broadband and telephone services. Thirdly, changes to the treatment of fixed principles in access determinations and special access undertakings, which will improve regulatory consistency and provide for more effective regulation. And fourthly, changes to NBN Co's line of business restrictions, which will ensure that NBN can dispose of surplus assets to any person, whereas currently it can only, under the existing law, sell those assets to another carrier or service provider. Mr Deputy Speaker, some of the reasons which have been levelled against the measures that have been removed from the bill warrant a response. It is necessary to put on the record why the government considers that those proposed measures were important and worth pursuing. Some have argued that the bill was moving away from the NBN model, highlighting proposed changes to non-discrimination obligations, to NBN Co's line of business restrictions and to the law governing authorisations for NBN Co's conduct. This was an ill-informed argument which did not reflect the reality that the government was proposing to fine-tune the framework to provide some additional flexibility. The government sought to make some modest changes to non-discrimination obligations facing NBN Co, with a view to promoting innovation through pilots or trials. In its review, the Vertican panel recognised that the current obligations do not promote innovation. Other measures that the government proposed in the bill sought to improve the consistency of regulatory decision-making and to cement procedural fairness requirements by clarifying the point at which the ACCC would be required to consult. The government sought to introduce a regulation-making power that could be used to amend NBN Co's line of business restrictions. This proposal responded to experience which has shown that the current restrictions are so sweeping that NBN Co is being prevented from operating on an optimal basis. This power, however, could not have been used to allow NBN Co to supply content or to supply retail communication services, and the exercise of this power would have taken the form of a disallowable instrument. This would have meant that the Parliament would have been able to oversee any regulation made by the Minister. Finally, under the bill as originally put forward, the bill would have amended existing authorisations for the purposes of competition law, which allow NBN Co to limit the number of points of interconnection to the national broadband network and require its customers to purchase bundled services. Some have erroneously sought to conflate the government's change in pricing policy already in place with the proposed change in legislation. The government went to the last election stating that it would remove uniform national pricing and it would require NBN Co instead to operate under price caps. This policy was reaffirmed in 2014 through the government's response to the Vertican review, so this is nothing new. The measure contained in the bill as put before the House simply sought to continue the existing authorisations introduced by the former government without reference to the former government's pricing policy. The object of the government's authorisation provision was to ensure that superfast carriage services are reasonably accessible to all people in Australia, wherever they reside or carry on business. Under this government, Mr Deputy Speaker, the NBN rollout is finally back on track. The NBN plans to expand its footprint by 15,000 premises per week, rising to 25,000 per week by the middle of the year. NBN is on track to meet its target to have 500,000 premises able to order a broadband service via fibre to the node by the end of June. Mr Deputy Speaker, the facts speak for themselves. NBN has met its rollout and revenue targets for the past 6 quarters in a row and is on course to meet its financial year 2016 targets published in the corporate plan. Under the coalition, under the Turnbull government, the number of connected households and businesses using the NBN has increased more than tenfold since 2013. 1 in 4 premises will have access to the national broadband network by the end of this year, and around 3/4 of all premises will be in the footprint by 2018. NBN Co reported strong revenues and activations for the half year to December 31 just a few weeks ago, and it will continue to report quarterly so the Australian community can judge for themselves. Mr Deputy Speaker, we said we would make the rollout faster, and it's very clear from the weekly reports published on NBN's website that is exactly what is happening. For example, the published weekly progress report shows the connections have been tracking above 14,000 per week, since the start of February. Connections, Mr Deputy Speaker, above 14,000 per week since the start of February. This is in stark contrast to the rollout under Labor, when the company only managed to connect 51,000 users to the built network in 3 years. 14,000 per week under the Turnbull government, 51,000 over 3 years under the previous government. The contrast is very stark indeed. Mr Deputy Speaker, the published corporate plans over the years from 2010 make it plain for all to see that the NBN under Labor was one of the most poorly managed infrastructure projects in the history of the Commonwealth.
I thank the Minister. The House will now consider... question is the bill will now read a second time. All those opinions say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk?
Second reading a bill for an act to amend the law relating to telecommunications and for related purposes.
The House will now consider the bill in detail. Understands the wish of the House to take the bill as a whole. So the question is that the bill be agreed to. The Minister.
I present a supplementary explanatory memorandum to the bill.
The Minister.
I ask leave of the House to move Government Amendments 1 to 5 as circulated together.
Is leave granted? Thank the member for Blaxland. The Minister.
I move Government Amendments 1 to 5 as circulated together.
The member for Blaxland.
That was it. That was it. Well, Deputy Speaker, that was extraordinary. That was extraordinary. For those who missed it, what we just saw there is the junior minister at the table just do a backflip worthy of Nadia Comaneci. Because in case you missed it, what he just did then is gut this bill like a fish. He came into this parliament in December and tabled this bill and gave us a lecture about how important this legislation was, told us that it improved competition, that it improved efficiency, and now he's just ripped all of that out. Just ripped all of that out. This bill has 8 parts, and the government has just ripped 5 of them out.
He's holding the fish skeleton up going to
ripped 5 of them out. How humiliating. How humiliating. In case you missed it, this is the first bill that's been introduced by this government on the NBN in 2.5 years.
It's been gutted like a fish.
And it's just been gutted like a fish. But I am glad to see the government capitulate so heavily, so quickly, because this is a bad bill. As I said when I spoke in the second reading debate, what the government has tried to do here is roll back important consumer and competition benefits that we delivered when we were in government. Things like universal wholesale pricing, things that provide fairness for people who live in regional Australia. It means that people living in the bush pay the same wholesale price for equivalent services as people who live in our big cities. And the Liberal Party wants to get rid of that, and the hapless National Party stood here ready to help them. And the only reason that it's not happening is because the Labor Party has stood in their way. And let's be very clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, the only reason they are doing this is not because they've changed their mind, because the minister just told us in summing up that he still thinks this is the right thing to do. The only reason they're doing it is because they know they can't get it through the Senate. And if they win the next election and they get control of the Senate, then you bet this legislation will be back. They'll be on to this like Donkey Kong. They'll be back into this, trying to pass the same legislation again. In the meantime, we have more of this mess that they've made of the NBN. Remember, the cost of the NBN is now double what Malcolm Turnbull said it would be. He said he'd build it for $29.5 billion. That's now blown out to up to $56 billion. The NBN is now going to take twice as long as Malcolm Turnbull said it would to deliver it to everyone in Australia. He said everyone in Australia would have access to the NBN this year. That's now blown out to the end of the decade. And the cost to fix up the copper, to make this dodgy second-rate NBN work, that's blown out not by 100%, not by 200%, not by 500%, by more than 1,000%. It was originally forecast to cost about $55 million. It's now over $600 million. And a leaked document last year showed that the Optus HFC network that they want to use for the NBN is not fit for purpose and will cost more than $700 million to fix so they can use that. Malcolm Turnbull said that it would be a modest cost to fix that. Now we know it's blown out to $700 million. And the minister might have something to say about this because he used to work at Optus. So it begs the question, what did he know about this? And did he tell the now Prime Minister that it wasn't going to be a modest cost to fix the Optus HFC network? Why didn't he tell the Prime Minister that he's wrong? Or did he? I wonder whether the minister will tell us the truth. And now, on top of this week, 2 more damaging leaked documents. The first, this document on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald this week, that revealed that the cost of building their dodgy second-rate NBN, the copper fibre to the node, is going up, and that the rollout of their fibre to the node is way behind their internal targets. This report, which is only just over a week old, says that they were supposed to be at 94,000 by the end of that week. It's only at 24,000. And then today, this report that reveals they've done a trial of a new type of fibre in Ballarat and Kooringal, and the cost of fibre is going down. And now, to add to this, we've got this humiliating back-down by the junior minister today, gutting this bill. Well, I can tell you, Deputy Speaker, we're very happy to assist the government in gutting their own bill. You should be embarrassed.
I thank the member for Blaxland. The Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There are a number of things that the Shadow Minister has said which do require some response. I remind the House that when the previous government left office, after 6 years of government, 4.5 years after they'd first announced their NBN Plan Phase 2, Mark II, they had managed to build out the network to such a tiny extent that only just over 300,000 Australian premises were in a position to be able to connect to the network should they choose to exercise that desire. The number now stands at around 1.775 million and is increasing at an extremely rapid rate. Not only are the total number of premises that can be connected increasing rapidly, we are also seeing the number of actual connections increasing rapidly, with the weekly rate now well above 14,000 per week, compared to Labor's frankly pathetic performance of connecting in 3 years just 51,000 premises. In other words, in less than 4 weeks, at the current run rate, under this government, NBN is connecting more people, more premises, than could be achieved in 3 years under the previous government. The reality is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that NBN is led by an experienced, competent board, chaired by Ziggy Switkowski, one of the most experienced telecommunications executives in Australia, let alone the world, a former chief executive of both Telstra and Optus. It is led by a CEO in Bill Morrow, who is deeply experienced, and across the management team there is a collection of highly qualified and experienced telecommunications executives. You may ask, surely this is a fairly obvious and basic thing to do, but bizarrely, Mr Deputy Speaker, it was not done under the previous government, and that is one clear reason why the rollout performance under the previous government was hopeless. What NBN Co is doing now, under the overall direction of the Turnbull government, and previously I might add under the very competent direction of the member for Wentworth as Minister for Communications, what NBN Co is doing now is calmly, pragmatically, systematically getting on with rolling out the network, putting in place all the fundamental and basic corporate disciplines of planning, of monitoring performance against plan, and achieving against targets. And that is why NBN Co has met its published targets now for 6 quarters in a row. Mr Deputy Speaker, it continues to be the case on the published numbers of NBN Co and on its internal reporting that fibre to the node connections are materially less expensive than fibre to the premises connections. At the same time, as the company has indicated in its public reporting, customer perceptions of fibre to the node show no difference to customer perceptions of fibre to the premises. So the ultimate test is, what do customers make of the services? And we are seeing the customer perceptions being consistent with the strategy that the Coalition took the 2013 election and the strategy that is now being implemented by NBN. Mr Deputy Speaker, the opposition spokesman continues to attempt to try and whip up some version of events which is at odds with reality. What we are seeing is a difficult and ambitious project, a project which we have consistently said is not one we would have started. We would not have chosen this as a starting point, but it fell to the Coalition, as it so often does, to clean up Labor's mess. And what we are doing is getting on with NBN as a company managing this ambitious rollout in a systematic, methodical, business-like fashion. The results are there. There's a lot more to do. It's a big and ambitious project. But under the Turnbull government, it's going very much in the right direction.
The member for Chifley.
What you just heard then was more of what the Shadow Minister pointed out, just extraordinary claims. I mean, you had here this suggestion from the Minister that they were coming in to clean up the NBN Co, and what a job they've been doing. What an amazing job they've been doing. Double the cost, slower rollout, people left with a substandard service, denied an expectation that was fuelled by those opposite that they would deliver more, and they haven't. You often hear this line that comes out of the Coalition, repeated by the Minister today, that after 3 years we didn't do enough, that Labor didn't do enough, that we didn't roll out enough. The biggest project, infrastructure project in the nation in modern generation, and we didn't do enough in 3 years. From a mob who had 19 goes at fixing broadband over the 13 years of their government and failed. 19 times, member for Wakefield, 19 times, and then they come in and say, you didn't do enough after 3 years. But they tried over more than a decade, 19 plans, constantly failed, And what they're doing is they're misleading the public about the quality of the rollout itself. What they're saying is, we've got a different way of being able to roll this out. There is nothing different about relying on copper. There is nothing different about relying on HFC. And there is nothing different about their approach when they've failed over 19 times. There is a reason why there's been a $15 billion blowout in their project. In the $15 billion blowout, which is the responsibility of both the Communications Minister, now Prime Minister, and that person, because you had a role to play in it, Minister, though we're working on making you a Shadow Minister. But you and also the then Communications Minister were responsible for arguing that HFC was better. The member for Greenway has pointed out on a number of occasions that the ACCC said the HFC network wasn't fit for purpose, that Optus was saying that the HFC network wasn't fit for purpose. My own constituents tell me that the HFC network isn't fit for purpose. They say it is fantastic, it gives you great speeds at 4 a.m. That's what they tell me. They tell me that Malcolm Turnbull's network provides you excellent download speeds if you get up at 4 a.m. and no one else is on that network. The HFC network is a network that cannot work when a lot of people use it, which is bizarre, because you've got this huge demand of people wanting a modern broadband network. They're told you can get it, but if you use it, and a lot of you use it, it'll be slow, so don't use it. That's the compelling logic of the Turnbull government in terms of what they're putting forward.
It's a cunning plan.
It is a completely cunning plan, member for Wakefield. It is. It is a broadband network absolutely designed by Blackadder's Baldrick, as the member for Wakefield rightly points out. And it may be the case that Baldrick is on the management team of NBN Co, because the minister pointed out the great management team. You have a CEO in Bill Morrow who turns up to Senate estimates and is asked a series of questions about the network he's managing, and probably 90% of the questions that were raised to him were taken on notice. I mean, if this was a person who had command of the facts and was such a singularly impressive management representative as the minister is suggesting, you'd think he'd be able to answer questions. But he can't. And the reason he can't is because his job's not focused. He is not focused on the job of this rollout. He is now in defensive mode, trying to work out why there is leak after leak from his own organisation. NBN Co's internal organisation is in revolt. It is in a rebellion. They do not believe in their heart of hearts that the network that is being foisted upon the Australian public by those opposite is one that will deliver, and that is why they're leaking. That is why. They don't have confidence in the CEO. They don't have confidence in Ziggy Switkowski, by the way. I mean, if Ziggy Switkowski was so great, why doesn't he spend more time talking about the NBN than going and telling us about the value of nuclear power? He seems, as his Suncorp shareholders are equally concerned, not focused on the job that is required and is necessary. He always diverts his attention. That's why you've got an organisation in revolt. That's why consumers are in revolt over this, and that's why we are being misled. We are being misled about this network rollout by those opposite, and they stand condemned for it.
I thank the member for Chifley. The member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. What we heard from the minister here at the table was just more of the spin and hypocrisy that has characterised this government's attitude from the get-go, And you only have to look, and I'm quoting here from the Sydney Morning Herald from 19 February 2014, the headline, "Coalition lied about true cost of NBN." Coalition lied about true cost of NBN. We had this person sitting at the table telling us for years, along with the then Shadow Communications Minister, that the NBN under Labor was going to cost $90 billion, and they repeated this often. But here, as we see in this report, when asked, that is, when Minister Fletcher was asked if the $90 billion estimate was then a political figure floated to win votes, Mr Fletcher admitted that figure was also wrong. And as the Shadow Minister here, and I quote again, "They just lied. They made that figure up." Well, I have a suggestion for the minister. Maybe you should go back to Palmerston Hospital, dig a few more holes and fill him in with concrete, because that's what he's good at doing. But we only see today yet another leak. Every member opposite spruiking an approach based on deception, and they should know about deception. And we only see today trials point to cheaper fibre option. Oh, really? And I quote, "Its apparent success, that is, of this new approach, suggests that at the same time as costs of the federal government's fibre to the node model have increased, the costs of the alternative fibre to the premises option preferred by the previous Labor government may be coming down." Well, who'd have thought? Who'd have thought that that would be the case, Mr Deputy Speaker? And you don't even have to just take it from me. I think we should take this from a few people that those on the other side would probably tend to agree with. Someone like, I don't know, the Deputy Prime Minister, who said himself, "People are in agreement that copper line is becoming redundant. The copper age was 5,300 years ago, and that is where copper belongs." So we have the Deputy Prime Minister, his own words, saying that the approach of this government and this minister at the table is wrong. But even then, you don't just have to take it from him. I think it was even the now very senior Senator Nash who actually coined the phrase fraud band in 2007, where she bagged fibre to the node technology, and I quote from Senator Nash, "It's widely understood in the telecommunications industry that FTTN will not deliver improved broadband speeds to rural and regional areas." And even if you don't want to take it from Senator Nash, even if you don't want to take it from her, let's have a look at Senator Barry O'Sullivan. Senator Barry O'Sullivan, in November 2014, NBN snub for Western Queensland sparks rift in coalition. Who thought there'd be a rift in the coalition? And I quote, "Sparks are flying within the coalition as fiery National Senator Barry O'Sullivan takes aim at Federal Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull for subjecting rural communities to third world services. It's a shame on our nation," Senator O'Sullivan said, and here's the good bit, "I'm embarrassed to be part of a party whose government would allow this to continue." That's Senator Barry, and he should be, and he should be. You know what, Mr Deputy Speaker, in this debate, we've heard all about the spin, all the lines trotted out by the backbench over here, everyone repeating the same stuff, My contribution to this debate, I primarily focused on actual constituents, real-world constituents, those that I share partly with the member for Chifley in Blacktown, who know they are getting ripped off, who know that their children are missing out, who know that their small businesses are missing out and they cannot properly function because of the abject failure by this government. And you only have to look at the evidence. Under this government, we continue to slip in the universal broadband rankings. Australia is slipping under this government. This has been nothing but untruths and spin from this government. They know, these constituents know, that this Prime Minister has failed them. He promised faster, sooner, more affordable. Fail, fail, fail. His key promise to deliver minimum speeds by the end of this year, not even lasting the first year of this government, not even seeing out 2013. In fact, it was probably the first key promise that this government broke. An abject failure, and all their spin won't convince the people of Australia they're getting a good deal under this government.
The member for Greenway, and I give the call to the member for Throsby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, when it comes to the national broadband network, this government has systematically misled the Australian people. Let us not forget, from a man who is credited with the grand title of having invented the internet, you'd think he'd know something about the policy that he once had stewardship of, Deputy Speaker. But before the last election, they told the Australian people that they could roll the national broadband network out to all of Australian households by this year. That it was going to be cheaper, it was going to be faster, and it was going to be better, Deputy Speaker.
The member for Throsby could resume his seat.
Deputy Speaker, under Standing Order 150B, debate is required to be relevant to the amendment before the House, and there are 5 amendments that are before the House. Nothing that the member has said so far is relevant to those amendments.
It relates directly to the bill and the amendments before it into the changes that are the bill, so I'll allow it to continue. The member for Throsby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Before the election, the then Shadow Minister for Communications, the member for Wentworth, said that he could deliver the national broadband network, albeit on a second-rate national broadband network, for $41 billion, Deputy Speaker. Well, within 18 months, that $41 billion had blown out to $56 billion, a 37% increase. So much for cheaper, Deputy Speaker. The cost has blown out by over 37%. Deputy Speaker, as far as faster goes, well, there are suburbs and suburbs within my electorate who were wetting their lips with the prospect of having access to the national broadband network by Christmas, Deputy Speaker. They are going to be very disappointed indeed, because now it appears they may not even be connected by 2020, Deputy Speaker. This is a region which is relying on the national broadband network to assist it in the economic transition from manufacturing to more advanced forms of economic activity. Deputy Speaker, then we get to better. And I would have expected the members who represent regional Australia to have something more to say in their party rooms or the joint party rooms about this, Deputy Speaker, because in regional Australia, like the rest of us, access to broadband, safe, reliable, affordable broadband is absolutely critical. If you're running a small home-based business, as an increased number of people in regional Australia are, if you are educating your children, or yourself are engaged in education, you're relying on broadband for distance education, Deputy Speaker. Connecting Indigenous communities, Deputy Speaker, through the National Broadband Network, absolutely critical. I'd have expected more people to be standing up here and having more to say about the importance of broadband in regional Australia, but it has been absolute crickets from that side, Deputy Speaker, absolute crickets. We could forgive, Deputy Speaker, we could forgive them for their incompetence. We could forgive them for their incompetence if it could be proved they did not know better, Deputy Speaker, if it could be proved that it did not know better. But in this morning's Sydney Morning Herald, it has become patently clear to everybody who has followed this debate that for over 18 months they did know better. For over 18 months they did know better, Deputy Speaker, and they have kept it a secret from the Australian people, because their own trials commissioned by this government and this minister and this Prime Minister have proven beyond doubt that Labor's model of connecting fibre to the household can actually be done cheaper, or at least as cheap, than the second-rate broadband rollout that they are currently engaged in, Deputy Speaker. They are trying to convince the Australian people that they can do it cheaper, that they can do it faster, that they can do it better, but we know that the opposite is the truth. And this was made patently obvious to all Australians when they picked up a copy of the Sydney Morning Herald today, Deputy Speaker, when we learnt that the trials commissioned by themselves are proving that the price is coming down to connect fibre to the household, and that it'll be at least half the price that it once was at the beginning of this rollout debate, Deputy Speaker. Now, I could forgive those members of the Liberal Party who don't really know much about regional Australia for sticking their hand up for this bill, but for the National Party, Deputy Speaker, for the National Party to stick their hand up to be voting for a bill which is going to increase prices for people in regional Australia, that is nothing more than a sin.
Thank the member for Throsby. Give the call to the member for Shortland.
Yes, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My first contribution to this debate is to offer an open invitation for the minister sitting at the table to visit my electorate. I will arrange a public meeting and invite the over 100 people's names that I have here to come along and talk to the minister. Because, Minister, what I have to say to you is that your NBN has caused absolute chaos in my electorate. As recently as last night, and I might add, Mr Speaker, I've been receiving emails from constituents on a very, very regular basis, and in relation to this particular legislation, I think it's quite humiliating, the backflip that the minister's taken in removing in the amendments that's before the House today. But I think it's better for there to be a backflip than for the minister to push ahead and to roll out an NBN that is absolutely isn't working. Now, I must share with the House, this is just one of the emails I've recently received, and it was one of my constituents writing on behalf of his elderly parents who live in a retirement village. And what he wrote to me was that the retirement village, I know the minister's...
Yes, I call the minister.
Standing Order 150, debate must be relevant to a clause or amendment before the House. Now, we're debating amendments 1 through to 5, and I invite the member to indicate which amendment she's speaking about, and if she can't do that, then obviously she ought not to be continuing.
Okay.
Further to the point of order, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Yes, okay.
What the member is trying to outline here is the humiliating backflip by the junior minister in effectively gutting half of this legislation.
Okay.
And the member is being relevant, and the minister's point of order is not a valid point of order.
The member's clearly not being relevant. There are 5 amendments before the House this morning, The first of them deals with pilots and trials, access determinations and special access undertakings. The second deals with line of business restrictions. The third deals with line of business restrictions and authorised conduct. The fourth with authorised conduct, and the fifth with declared services and eligible services. I invite the member to indicate which one of those she is addressing, and if she can't do that, then obviously she's not eligible to speak under the standing orders.
Okay.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I appreciate the Minister explaining in depth the breadth of his humiliating backflip by outlining every part of the bill that he's now deleting. But the point is the member is being relevant by talking about access to universal wholesale pricing.
Okay. I asked the member to be relevant to the question.
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I must say I understand why the Minister wants to stop me speaking. He doesn't want to hear about elderly people that are without phone. He doesn't want to hear about people that signed up to his NBN and were promised fast-speed broadband, but they're getting a slower speed broadband than they were receiving previously. And yes, I can speak to the amendments, and yes, I can speak to the actual legislation as well in consideration of detail. And, Minister, I don't need to identify which amendment I'm talking to. Minister, in consideration in detail, we are considering the legislation before the House in detail, and the details that I'm referring to relate to this minister's total failure, his backflip, the fact that he is not prepared to front up to people, tell the truth. He may have worked for a telecommunications company, but he's never been out there and spoken to people. And what I'm doing is generously inviting him to come into my electorate and meet my constituents. They would love to talk to him. Ring my office. I'll get my office to ring your office after this, my contribution to this debate. We'll organise a time so you can come along and explain to all those people in Shortland electorate, elderly people without any phone, without any NBN and without any action from this government.
Order. The member's time has expired. I call the honourable member for Wakefield.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I was talking on the bill before, and you know, there's this deathly silence and the minister's sitting there, and we very rarely see any animation from him. But the minute you get onto this bill, where, as the Shadow Minister said, they've gutted it like a fish, just stripped all the guts out of it, all the insides out of it, five we've got the member for Higgins here. She's replaced the cop from Kooyong, so don't get me started. Another one who's playing fantasy front bench and late at night working out when she's Prime Minister. Oh, I wonder who's going to be a minister. Maybe you'll get a gig for Treasurer then. And we'll see some animation, but only when you get onto telecommunications. It's the only time the mummy, the member for Bradfield, sort of emerges from his crypt and wanders around. And of course, I've got to make sure I'm talking about the amendments, Deputy Speaker, because those in the gallery would be fascinated to know all about the access to universal pricing and the like, and they know they don't want to hear from the mummy again, the member for Bradfield, emerging from his crypt to the dispatch box to tell us all. You know, I have to confess I misled the House in my speech, because I said that the Howard government had 8 broadband plans, but you know what? It was 19. The member for Chifley tells me it was 19 plans over 11 years. I mean, what were they doing? Talk about being asleep at the wheel. And now we have their first broadband bill in 2.5 years. The first one, this is after the Prime Minister has been sent to destroy the National Broadband Network when he was the minister. That was his briefing note from the member for Ruinga. Did you see them at the table last night at the anniversary of the Howard years of the 19? They could have been selling, instead of celebrating 20 years from the Howard government, they could have been celebrating 19 plans which did nothing on the National Broadband Network, and maybe they could all sit round. You know, it was pretty uncomfortable camera shots there of they're all sitting around the table. But
on the
menu,
everything was curdled.
Order.
Now, I know, Deputy Speaker, you want me to speak about the amendments, and I'll be sure to, because we don't want to remind the minister about how when they embarked on the copper on the copper plan, they started out with a costing of $29.5 billion, and it went to $56 billion. 56, and then they promised that everybody would have the national broadband network by 2016, and here we are in 2016, and it's now 2020. And for all those in the gallery, the effect of that on their small business, on their ability of their child to, download their homework and interact with the education system on the internet, all of that is diminished by this government's preoccupation with destroying a great national project. And now we see their first bill come into this place, and you'd think they had enough time to think about it after 2.5 years, and the minister gets up here and presents 5 amendments destroying the integrity of this bill and all of their work over the last 2.5 years, and he gets up here and he gives a speech that lasted, what?
No, there was no speech.
There was no speech. All right, so there was no speech on these amendments, and then the only time we see any animation, he lurches up to pick on the poor old member for Shortland, who was just talking about her constituents and their need for broadband. I mean, how could that not relate to the amendments, Deputy Speaker? And your time was consumed as well. But I'm reminded. I'm reminded by my good friend here, Throsby. Yes, the member for Throsby. I'm due to go to Port Kembla. I kept on thinking Port Kembla. I was thinking about steel, but that's another story. But you know, the Sydney Morning Herald. Trials point to cheaper fibre option. Gosh, and you're embarking on a copper network and this sort of hodgepodge of pay TV cappers. And that's what the minister comes here, gives no speech, guts a bill, because we all know they'll end up building fibre in the end. That's what they'll end up doing, because that's the future option. That's what Labor was going to do. That's what everybody in the public wants you to do. But this government, so bent were they on destroying Labor's legacy, that they embarked on a costlier plan, they embarked on a plan that inhibits internet speeds, and they embarked on a plan which will cost the taxpayer dearly. And we're expected by the minister to take all this lying down. Well, we won't. We'll stand up for the national broadband network.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Chifley.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker, and I take up the invitation of the minister to address certain elements of the bill and the amendments. We have constantly, through this debate, raised our concern about the prospect that universal pricing, wholesale pricing, will be watered down, that this will lead to an exacerbation of what we're already concerned about, a digital divide, not just in terms of the rollout of the network, but the pricing and people's ability to access broadband at the same price, regardless of where they live in the country. That was the objective, the vision, the motivation, that we would not have the regions left behind, either in terms of infrastructure or pricing. And so we've had these concerns, and we've raised it through the debate in relation to the watering down of the safeguards and also the concern about pricing. Through the course of the debate too, we have raised the fact that the former CEO of NBN Co has pointed out what he believes to be the cause of the $15 billion blowout in this project, which is the emphasis on the HFC network and the fibre-to-the-node network that has been rolled out, and the move away from what we had previously had in place. Now, we've had some very serious concerns raised, as the member for Wakefield and as the Shadow Minister for Communications have raised in relation to the Sydney Morning Herald today, that has indicated that there has been a trial, pilots, which are referred to in the amendments. Pilots and trials are referred to in the amendments. Well, we have a pilot and trial here. This pilot and trial will use a new version of cabling that will allow fibre to the premises to occur. And yet we're not being told about it. Instead, we are having blowouts on this project because of an alternative mode, alternative structuring of the project by the coalition that has had an emphasis on HFC, which, as I've indicated earlier, constituents have said to me does not work when a lot of people are on the network. We have a fibre-to-the-node network that is nowhere near reaching the breadth, the reach that the coalition promised, and yet they are having pilots and trials of new systems that we are not being told about. And so I invite the minister because NBN Co refused flatly to respond to this trial and the issue raised in the leaked document. And so this is the opportunity for the minister to tell the Australian Parliament and the Australian people, are you going to move to a system we have long advocated for, which is fibre to the premises, based on the savings achieved by this? Because if you're not, then what you are saying is you will continue to adopt a philosophy and an approach which has led to this blowout of $15 billion so far. $15 billion. And it is this type of blowout that is forcing you to put into this bill a requirement to water down universal pricing, because you want, in effect, for the regions to pay more for broadband services, because this is how you are making up the losses. You are accounting for the blowout by changing the pricing, making the regions pay for your bad mistakes. And yet we have a trial that shows, through your own documents, in this document, Minister, shows that you are able to roll out this network along the same lines as what we said, fibre to the premises. You can do it cheaper. We're happy if a way has been found to do it cheaper, because the reality is, with projects like this, infrastructure projects of this magnitude, as they roll out and progress, you find ways to do things more efficiently and cheaper. And if that has been found, good. What you should be doing is delivering the people of Australia what they want: faster broadband, which is delivered through fibre to the premises, and it can be done in a way that avoids the blowout, the $15 billion, avoids the watering down of the universal pricing approach that we think, the universal access pricing that would allow, if you're in a city or in a region, to get the pricing in wholesale terms the same, and would deliver them a service they want. So what we want to know is, if you are undertaking pilots and you are undertaking trials, you've done it in 2 spots in Australia already, Ballarat being one of the places, then tell the Australian people. You've got the chance to tell them the way in which you're changing the delivery of the service to make it efficient, but do it and cheaper, and to do it in a way that people want. And I certainly invite the minister to respond, because it's clear they have been hiding these type of trials from view and refusing to be transparent about them.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Throsby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's important, in considering the detail of the amendments and the bill before the House, that we understand the history, that is, the process which has led to this bill being before the House today. And I take you back, Deputy Speaker, to the pre-election commitments that were made by the now Prime Minister, the then member for Wentworth, where he promised that he could deliver a national broadband network that his then leader didn't believe in. Let's be very clear about this. His then leader didn't believe in it, because his then leader was committed to a style of politics which predates colour television. We're black, you're white. You're white, we're black. And unless it can be distilled down into 3-word slogans, goodies and baddies, you're for it or against it, the then leader of the opposition—
Yes, the member will resume his seat.
Member must be relevant to an amendment before the House. He's not being relevant.
I ask the member to be relevant.
If members of this place are to cast a vote on the 5 enumerated schedules and their contained amendments, that they understand the context, that they understand the context of how these amendments have come before the House, how they have changed in their journey from the party room to the Senate and then to the House. Because I rather suspect, Deputy Speaker, that there are members of the National Party and regional members of the Liberal Party who do not even understand the changes that have been made to this bill from when it left their caucus room, when they all stuck their hands in the air and said, "I support higher prices for people living in regional and rural Australia," to Bush consumers. That's what they voted for in their party room, Deputy Speaker. They do not understand the changes that have been made as that bill went from the party room to the Senate and then from the Senate to this House today. So it's important, and we can be confident that the member for Bradfield, the Shadow Minister, will have no part in educating those members on his side on the bill that they're voting for. So it's incumbent on members of this side of the House
to provide some context and some education to those poor, hapless members of the National Party and the regional Liberals about the impact that this bill is going to have upon their constituents. So let's look at those issues, Deputy Speakers, because when the bill was before the Senate, it had provisions within there which were wedded to ensuring that if you were a broadband client in regional and rural Australia, if you were one of the thousands of Australians who made a submission to the Regional Telecommunications Review and expressed your concerns about the impact of the failure of the government to deliver decent broadband services to people in the bush, then, Deputy Speaker, and I draw your attention, Deputy Speaker, to the report of the Regional Telecommunications, a very good report, I have to say, where they highlight the importance of having ubiquitous broadband services in the bush to enable them, if you're a farm-based business, Deputy Speaker, or a regional-based small business, having broadband to enable you to access the markets and the supply chains of the world. Absolutely critical. I know this because I have businesses who are today in my electorate making decisions about whether they move out of where they're currently based to an electorate, to an area where they have access to broadband, Deputy Speaker, because of failures of this government, because of the abject failures of this government, Deputy Speaker. That's why I go to the history of this bill, because it's incumbent upon this side of the House to explain to those hapless nationals about what they have supported. Now, the Vertigan Committee was given the Herculean task of providing some credibility, some evidence to the pre-election commitments of the government, Deputy Speaker. And it was a task equivalent to the cleaning of the Aegean stables, I have to tell you, Deputy Speaker. It was a task equivalent to the cleaning of the Aegean stables. They have attempted to provide a factual basis about how the government, with a scrap of credibility, could destroy the architecture, the engineering architecture of the National Broadband Network, Deputy Speaker, as well as the business model which underpins it, Deputy Speaker. They have failed. But that is the background to this bill, Deputy Speaker. I just want to emphasise the point. If you are living in regional and rural Australia, if you are trying to educate your kids, if you are trying to run a small home-based business, Deputy Speaker, or trying to just have the social interactions that many of us take for granted, access to affordable broadband is critical, and these guys are against it.
The time has expired. The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I put the question. All of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The question now is that this bill, as amended, be agreed to. I put the question. All of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The bill, as amended, has been agreed to.
Leave of the House to move the third reading immediately.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. Minister.
I move that this bill be now read a third time.
All that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.